The blue diamond weighed 45 carats. It had belonged to kings and been worn by queens who lost their heads. Legends claimed it carried a curse that destroyed everyone who possessed it. Evelyn Walsh McLean owned it for 36 years. She wore it to dinner parties and funerals. She let her Great Dane carry it around the house. She hid it in couch cushions during gatherings and made guests hunt for it like children searching for Easter eggs. When people warned her about the curse, she laughed and put it on anyway. By the time she died, her 9-year-old son had been struck by a car and killed in front of their home. Her husband had descended into madness, spending his final years in a locked psychiatric ward. Her daughter had overdosed on sleeping pills at 24. The newspaper empire her husband inherited had been sold at auction. The 75-acre estate where presidents once played golf had been demolished to make room for wartime housing. Was the Hope Diamond cursed? Or was Evelyn Walsh McLean simply a woman handed too much money, too young, with no one to teach her what to do with it? Her father would have recognized the danger. Thomas Walsh had arrived in America as a penniless Irish immigrant and spent decades chasing gold before he found it. He understood what sudden wealth could do to people who had not earned it slowly. He built a fortune from nothing and watched his daughter spend it on diamonds and parties and disasters she could not see coming. This is the story of America's last great days of the Gilded Age. A woman who bought the most famous jewel in the world and wore it while her life fell apart around her. A woman who fed hungry veterans during the Depression and got swindled out of $100,000 trying to rescue a kidnapped baby. A woman who saw presidents and criminals pass through her drawing room and never learned to tell the difference. She was born in a Colorado mining camp. She died in a Georgetown townhouse with servants who did not know what to do with her jewelry. Everything that happened between those 2 points reads like a cautionary tale about money and madness and the things we cannot buy, no matter how hard we try. The story begins not with the diamond, but with the gold that paid for it. Chapter 1. Daughter, I've struck it rich. The rock looked worthless. Dull gray stone with something that might have been rust. The previous owners had dug tunnels through it, searching for silver, and found nothing worth keeping. They abandoned their claims and moved on, convinced the mountain had fooled them. Thomas Walsh saw what they had missed. Failure had been his teacher for 2 decades. Colorado had shown him every way a man could lose money chasing precious metal. Other prospectors struck it rich, while Walsh watched from the margins, learning from their luck and his own mistakes. By 1896, when he arrived in Ouray at 46 years old, most men would have surrendered to reality. Walsh had different plans. The abandoned claims in Imogene Basin sat 11,000 feet above sea level. Snow closed the passes for half the year. The men who had worked there before him were hunting silver ore, the obvious bright metal that had made fortunes across the San Juans until the price collapsed in 1893. They walked past the gray rock every day without recognizing what it contained. Gold telluride, a compound that looked nothing like the gleaming nuggets most prospectors imagined. The ore was laced with it, hidden in plain sight for years. Walsh bought the claims quietly and worked through the rest of that year in secret. Trusted men helped him confirm his suspicions. Samples were processed away from curious eyes. When certainty replaced hope, he went home to tell his family. His daughter Evalyn was not yet 12 years old. She remembered the moment for the rest of her life, recounting it in her memoir decades later. Her father came through the door with something new in his face, something she had never seen before. He picked her up and spoke 5 words that would shape everything that followed. Daughter, I've struck it rich. The Camp Bird mine took its name from the gray jays that stole food from the workers. Within 2 years, the operation was producing $5,000 in ore every single day. At the turn of the century, that amount would equal roughly $150,000 in modern currency. The wealth accumulated faster than anyone could spend it. Walsh had left Ireland at 19 with nothing but carpentry skills and a sister who shared his ambition. Railroad work came first, then a hotel in Leadville, then marriage to a Kansas schoolteacher named Carrie Bell Reed. Evelyn arrived in 1886, born in a mining town, while her father still chased the dream that had drawn thousands of other men west. Most of those men found only disappointment. Walsh found patience instead. Geology books filled his evenings. Each failure taught him something about where precious metals hid and how to recognize them. While other prospectors rushed from strike to strike, following rumors and luck, Walsh examined abandoned claims that everyone else had given up on. The method required discipline. The discipline eventually paid. By 1900, Camp Bird comprised 103 claims spread across 941 acres. 12 mills processed the ore around the clock. Walsh employed hundreds of men and treated them better than any mine owner in Colorado, paying top wages and building a boarding house at altitude with electric lighting and porcelain wash basins. When violent labor disputes erupted across the region, Camp Bird remained peaceful. Men who were treated well worked well. Walsh had grown up with nothing. He remembered what that felt like. In 1902, a British syndicate offered to buy him out. The negotiations produced a final price of approximately $5.2 million, paid in cash and stock. Thomas Walsh had entered Colorado as a penniless immigrant. He left as one of the wealthiest men in America. The family moved to Washington. The capital was where power lived, and Walsh wanted his daughter near it. A mansion would follow, one grand enough to announce their arrival to everyone who mattered. But that construction lay ahead. First came the adjustment to a world where money was no longer a problem. Thomas Walsh died on April 8, 1910. He was 60 years old. His daughter was 23, unmarried, and suddenly one of the richest young women in America. Everything he had built now belonged to her. Chapter 2. The mansion on Massachusetts Avenue. Workers broke ground near DuPont Circle in the spring of 1901. Over the next 2 years, a mansion rose on Massachusetts Avenue that would become one of the most expensive private residences in the capital's history. Thomas Walsh had hired Henry Anderson, a New York architect known for designing homes that announced their owner's wealth without apology. The brief was straightforward: build something Washington would not forget. 60 rooms filled the floor plan. The main level held a ballroom with gilded ceilings, where Walsh intended to host senators and diplomats. Above it, a private theater allowed the family to entertain guests with performances that never required leaving home. A French salon drew its inspiration from Versailles, though Walsh had never seen Versailles and did not particularly care about French history. The point was impression, not authenticity. The exterior combined Renaissance columns with Baroque curves and Art Nouveau metalwork. Critics who tried to categorize the style gave up and simply called it extravagant. By the time construction finished, the cost exceeded $800,000, placing it among the most lavish building projects Washington had seen. Stories attached themselves to the house almost immediately. Workers claimed Walsh had hidden a gold nugget somewhere in the foundation, marking the source of his wealth in a place no visitor would ever see. Others said a gold bar was mortared above the main entrance. These details may have been true, or they may have been the kind of legends that money attracts. Walsh never confirmed or denied them. The family took possession in the fall of 1903. Evelyn was 17, old enough to understand what the house represented, but young enough to feel bewildered by it. She had spent her childhood watching her father fail and try again across the mining towns of Colorado. Now footmen opened doors for her, and maids laid out dresses that cost more than her father had earned in entire years before the strike. Walsh used the house exactly as he had intended. Presidents visited. Theodore Roosevelt counted Walsh among his friends. King Leopold of Belgium exchanged letters with him about mining investments in the Congo. The carpenter from Tipperary had built himself a palace and filled it with the most powerful people he could attract. 3 years earlier, Walsh had sent his daughter to Paris for voice lessons and cultural refinement. Evelyn treated the trip as an opportunity for rebellion. She colored her hair and drank wine at cafes where no one cared about her family's newly acquired respectability. The voice lessons never progressed. The independence she discovered would prove more lasting. Now she stood in a house designed to project exactly the kind of propriety she had already begun to resist. Her father saw the mansion as an arrival. Evelyn saw it as a cage with gilded bars. She was not wrong, but the bars were not the mansion itself. They were the expectations that came with being the only daughter of one of the richest men in America, the pressure to marry well, the scrutiny of society pages, the assumption that her future had already been decided by her father's success. The house still stands at 2020 Massachusetts Avenue. Indonesia purchased it in 1951 for $335,000 and converted it into their embassy. The ballroom survives. So does the grand staircase. Tourists occasionally photograph the facade without knowing who built it, or what became of the daughter who once descended those stairs in gowns she did not choose, toward a future she could not yet see clearly. Chapter 3. The First Tragedy. The automobile was still a novelty in 1905. Wealthy families bought them as toys, racing along country roads at speeds that terrified horses and pedestrians alike. Crashes happened constantly and without safety features of any kind. The results ranged from embarrassment to death. That summer, Evelyn and her brother Vincent were in Newport, Rhode Island. The resort town attracted America's richest families during the warm months, and the Walshes now belonged to that circle. Thomas Walsh had rented a cottage for the season. His children had access to cars. The details of what happened next remain unclear in the historical record. What is certain is that a car carrying both Walsh children crashed. Vincent, not yet 18 years old, did not survive. Evelyn lived, but the impact shattered her leg. Doctors set the bone and prescribed morphine for the pain. The relief was immediate and total. Evelyn continued taking the drug long after the bones had healed. Within months, she had developed a dependency that would follow her for years. She was 19 years old. Her only brother was dead. Her body was broken, and she had discovered a substance that made grief feel distant and manageable. Thomas Walsh buried his son and watched his daughter struggle with an addiction he did not fully understand. Dependency on opiates was common in this era, often beginning exactly as Evelyn's had, with legitimate prescriptions for legitimate pain. Doctors did not yet grasp how quickly the drug could take hold. Patients who tried to stop discovered withdrawal symptoms that made continued use feel like the only option. The family did not discuss Vincent's death publicly. The Walsh mansion on Massachusetts Avenue continued to host dinners and receptions. Evelyn appeared at social functions with her leg still healing, her pupils occasionally betraying what she had taken to get through the evening. Her father tried treatments, sanitariums, specialists, gradual reduction programs, but Evelyn abandoned them when the discomfort became unbearable. Morphine offered something she could not find elsewhere, a buffer between herself and a world that had just demonstrated how quickly everything could disappear. Vincent had been her companion through the uncertain years before wealth arrived. Now she stood alone as the only surviving Walsh child, heir to a fortune she had never asked for, carrying damage both visible and hidden. Her leg healed imperfectly. Evelyn would walk with a slight limp for the rest of her life. The addiction proved harder to treat. She would struggle with opiates and later with alcohol, cycling through periods of sobriety and relapse. The pattern established in 1905 never fully released her. 5 years later, her father would be dead. But first, Evelyn Walsh would meet a young man from another wealthy family, a man with his own demons, a man who would give her access to even more money and even more ways to destroy herself. His name was Edward Beale McLean. His friends called him Ned. His family owned the Washington Post. Chapter 4. The Golden Couple. Edward Beale. McLean came from the kind of family that made the Walshes look like newcomers. John R. McLean owned the Washington Post and the Cincinnati Enquirer. The McLeans had wielded influence in the capital for decades, long before Thomas Walsh struck gold in Colorado. Ned, as everyone called him, was handsome and charming and completely unequipped for adult life. He had been given everything except responsibility. Drinking came easily, so did spending. He moved through Washington's social scene with the confidence of someone who had never faced consequences for anything. Evelyn recognized a version of herself. They were both heirs who had never learned to earn anything. They were both dulling private pain with substances, Ned with alcohol and Evelyn with morphine. Together, they could be honest about their weaknesses in ways neither could manage alone. Thomas Walsh saw the danger immediately. So did John McLean. two young people with unlimited resources and limited self-control, drawn together by mutual recklessness. The objections only made the romance more appealing. In July of 1908, Evelyn and Ned eloped. They married in Denver, far from both families and the Washington press that would have turned their wedding into spectacle. Evelyn was 22. Ned was 23. Between them, they would eventually control assets worth hundreds of millions in today's currency. The honeymoon lasted nearly a year. Europe first, then Turkey and Egypt. They spent without counting, and no one refused them anything. In Paris, Evelyn saw a diamond that stopped her mid-sentence. The Star of the East weighed 94 carats. It hung from a chain of smaller stones, a pear-shaped diamond so large it seemed artificial. The dealer wanted $120,000. Ned paid. Evelyn wore it that evening. She would wear it for decades, often pairing it with other stones that would have been the centerpiece of any normal collection. The Star of the East was merely her first great diamond. It would not be the most famous. The purchase established a pattern. When Evelyn wanted something, Ned provided it. When Ned wanted to drink, Evelyn looked away. They enabled each other with silent efficiency. The marriage was not happy in any conventional sense, but it functioned on terms they both accepted. They returned to Washington in 1909 as one of the wealthiest young couples in America. Both families had accepted the union, if not celebrated it. The Walsh properties and the McLean newspapers now formed a single empire. Thomas Walsh died the following April. His health had declined since Vincent's death, and some who knew him believed he never recovered from burying his son. Everything passed to Evelyn, joining what Ned would eventually inherit. The golden couple now had mansions, newspapers, diamonds, and each other. What they lacked was any idea what to do with it all. Chapter 5. The Hope Diamond. Pierre Cartier understood that selling to the very wealthy required more than gemology. It required narrative. In the winter of 1910, Cartier invited Evelyn Walsh McLean to view a stone he had recently acquired. The diamond was a blue so deep it seemed to hold darkness inside it, 45 carats. He could have described its clarity and cut. Instead, he told her about the curse. The stone, he said, had been stolen from a Hindu idol in India centuries ago. A French merchant named Tavernier brought it to Europe and was later torn apart by wild dogs. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette possessed it before the guillotine claimed them. Since then, the diamond had passed through the hands of an Amsterdam cutter, murdered by his own son, a Greek owner who drove off a cliff, a Russian prince who shot the mistress he had given it to, and a sultan who lost both his throne and his sanity. Everyone who touched this diamond, Cartier concluded, met with disaster. Evelyn was not frightened. She was fascinated. A brother already dead, a car crash that left her with a permanent limp, and a morphine habit. Misfortune held no terror for someone who had already met it. If anything, the curse made the diamond more interesting, more personal. Cartier named his price, $180,000. Evelyn left without buying, but she could not stop thinking about it. Weeks passed. She returned. The sale closed on January 28, 1911. The contract reportedly included an unusual clause allowing her to return the diamond if any family member died within a specified period. Much of Cartier's curse was invention. Tavernier had not been killed by dogs. He died in Russia at 84, wealthy and respected. The connection to Marie Antoinette was tenuous. The stone she supposedly possessed was the French blue, a larger diamond from which the hope was later cut. The tales of murdered cutters and suicidal Greeks came from newspaper articles that valued drama over accuracy. None of this mattered to Evelyn. She had purchased a legend as much as a gemstone. The Hope diamond gave her a story that belonged to her alone. She treated it like a toy. Her Great Dane carried it around the house in his mouth. During parties, she hid it in sofa cushions and made guests search for it. At dinners and funerals alike, the blue stone hung from her neck. When reporters asked about the curse, she smiled and said bad luck objects were lucky for her. The diamond became inseparable from her identity. Evelyn Walsh McLean, the woman who laughed at curses. Within 8 years, her 9-year-old son would be dead. Chapter 6. Friendship. The estate covered 75 acres along Wisconsin Avenue. Evelyn and Ned purchased it shortly after their marriage and hired John Russell Pope to design the main residence, years before he would create the Jefferson Memorial and the National Gallery of Art. Friendship was a different kind of commission. The house sprawled across grounds that included formal gardens, stables, and a golf course where powerful men could conduct business away from public eyes. Guests arrived to find orchestras on the lawn and tables heavy with food that most Americans saw only in photographs. Prohibition meant nothing here. Ned Walsh owned newspapers. He knew which officials to cultivate. The law stopped at the property line. Evelyn presided over these gatherings with the Hope Diamond at her throat. Hostess to senators and ambassadors, gatekeeper to a world where an invitation to friendship determined who mattered in Washington. Warren Harding was a regular visitor before he reached the White House. He and Ned shared an enthusiasm for poker, whiskey, and avoiding serious conversation. When Harding won the election in 1920, the Walshes believed they had secured access to the presidency itself. They were not wrong. Harding visited Friendship during his time in office. He used the Walsh golf course while aides waited and senators angled for his attention. Dinners mixed politics with pleasure in ways that would later seem reckless. The Walshes had achieved what few families managed, a sitting president treating their home as an extension of his own. Alice Roosevelt Longworth moved through the same circles but watched with colder eyes. Teddy Roosevelt's daughter had grown up in the actual White House. She understood that proximity to power was not the same as possessing it. Alice collected secrets the way Evelyn collected jewels, and she remembered everything. Decades afterward, Alice described the Harding administration with contempt, a betrayal of her father's legacy. She recalled Ned drinking his way through evenings while his newspapers printed whatever the administration wanted. She saw Evelyn mistake wealth for influence, visibility for respect. But such judgments belong to a later era. In 1918 and 1919, friendship seemed untouchable. The Walshes entertained congressmen and cabinet members. Their son Vincent, 9 years old, ran across the same grounds where senators strolled. The estate represented everything the family had accumulated: wealth, connections, visibility. Then, in May of 1919, a car struck Vincent on Wisconsin Avenue, just beyond the gates of the property his parents had built to keep the world at bay. The Harding years still lay ahead. The scandals and the losses had barely begun. But Evelyn Walsh would host every party that followed as a woman who had already buried her only son. Evelyn thrived in this world. She had been raised around money, but now she was surrounded by power, and the difference mattered. Wealth could be inherited. Power had to be cultivated. She cultivated it with charm, unpredictability, and a refusal to behave as she was expected to. She laughed too loudly, spoke too directly, gambled recklessly, and dressed in ways that made conservative Washington uncomfortable. Men underestimated her because of it. Women whispered. Evelyn listened to everything. Ned, meanwhile, drifted. The newspaper ran itself more than he ran it. Editors protected him from his own impulses. Alcohol softened his edges and dulled what discipline remained. He enjoyed the access the paper provided, but resented the responsibility that came with it. His name still opened doors, but increasingly it was Evelyn who determined which doors mattered. The Hope Diamond entered this world not as a curse, but as a curiosity. Purchased on a whim, worn without reverence, it became another piece of theater in Evelyn's performance. Newspapers wrote about it endlessly. Photographs lingered on it. Society columnists treated it as an extension of her personality. Dangerous, excessive, irresistible. Evelyn encouraged the attention. She understood spectacle. In a city built on appearances, spectacle was leverage. Tragedy, when it arrived, did not announce itself as destiny. It came quietly, like an accounting error that compounds over time. Their first child died young. Ned drank more. Arguments turned sharper, then colder. Publicly, nothing changed. Friendships still glittered. Guests still arrived in motor cars. Music still floated across manicured lawns. Privately, the marriage hollowed out. Washington preferred the illusion. The McLeans provided it. As long as the parties continued, as long as the newspaper headlines remained respectable, the city was willing to look away. This was the unspoken contract of elite society, discretion in exchange for acceptance. Evelyn honored it outwardly, even as she tested its limits. By the time war clouds gathered over Europe again, the McLeans were already fractured. Their lives looked whole from a distance, but up close the seams were visible, financial strain masked by display, emotional collapse concealed by routine. The diamonds sparkled, the estate endured, the name still carried weight. What no one could see yet was how fragile all of it was, how quickly admiration could curdle into judgment, how easily wealth could turn into liability, how power, once assumed permanent, could evaporate when history shifted its attention elsewhere. Chapter 7. The Death of Vincent. The newspapers reported it as a tragic accident, a child darting into the road, a driver who could not stop in time, the kind of loss that struck families everywhere, wealthy and poor alike. But Evelyn Walsh was not every mother. She owned the most famous, cursed jewel in the world, and the public had not forgotten what Cartier had said about everyone who possessed it. Condolence letters arrived at Friendship after the funeral. So did other messages, darker ones. Strangers wrote to inform Evelyn that her son's death proved the stone carried evil. Ministers she had never met urged her to sell it before another victim fell. Newspapers that had once celebrated her parties now speculated openly about whether she had brought this suffering upon herself. Evelyn did not respond. She did not sell. In her memoir, written decades later, she addressed the accusations directly. If the hope carried a curse, she argued, then it had been cursed long before she bought it. Bad luck objects, she insisted, were lucky for her. The logic made no sense. It was not supposed to. It was the reasoning of a woman who refused to let the world see her break. At her son's funeral, the blue stone hung from her neck. At dinners in the months that followed, it hung there still. She would not remove it. To do so would mean admitting that the gossips and ministers and strangers were right, that she had somehow caused her own child's death by refusing to fear a legend. Grief found other outlets. The morphine dependency she had carried since 1905 deepened. Alcohol joined it. Ned was drinking heavily, and Evelyn matched him. The parties at Friendship continued. The guest lists remained impressive. The orchestras played on. Stopping would require acknowledging that something had broken. None of it brought Vincent back. His bedroom sat empty. His name became something guests learned not to speak. Evelyn's brother had died in a car accident 14 years earlier. Now her firstborn son had died the same way. The pattern seemed designed by something cruel. Wealth offered no shield. The finest doctors, the largest estate, the most powerful friends in Washington, all of it meant nothing against a car moving too fast and a boy in the wrong place. She continued wearing the stone for another 28 years. When Evelyn Walsh died in 1947, it was still around her neck. She had insisted to the end that it brought her luck. The evidence suggested otherwise, but evidence had never been the point. Warren G. Harding came often. He preferred Friendship to the White House, where walls listened and history waited. At Evelyn's table, he relaxed. Here he could laugh too loudly, drink too much, forget for a moment the burden of office. She treated him not as a president, but as a man, flawed, indulgent, eager for approval. He rewarded that intimacy with access. Gossip traveled both directions. What was said at Friendship rarely appeared in print, even when it should have. Evelyn believed this discretion was power. In truth, it was dependency. Her influence existed only so long as she remained useful, entertaining, accommodating, silent. The Washington Post, still under her husband's name, acted as both shield and weapon, though increasingly it was wielded by others. Ned McLean liked to imagine himself a kingmaker. In reality, he was a man borrowing authority from institutions he no longer fully controlled. Alcohol accelerated that decline. Ned drank not for pleasure, but for escape. His moods darkened. His judgment faltered. Friends noticed. Editors noticed. Creditors noticed. Evelyn compensated, as she always had, by expanding the spectacle. Larger parties, brighter jewels, louder laughter. The Hope diamond became her signature, worn not cautiously but defiantly, as if daring fate to act. Washington watched with fascination. The city had always enjoyed the rise and fall of its benefactors. Society columns tracked Evelyn's gowns, while political reporters quietly tracked her diminishing relevance. Harding's sudden death in 1923 ended more than a presidency. It severed the McLean's most valuable connection. The circle tightened, invitations slowed, influence evaporated without announcement. Evelyn did not retreat. She had never learned how. Instead, she clung to the idea that proximity itself conferred safety, that wealth, visibility, and charm formed a kind of armor. But power is not loyal. It does not remember favors once they become inconvenient. The same city that had courted her now observed her with polite distance, waiting to see what would fall next. Behind the scenes, the numbers no longer worked. The newspaper bled money. The estate consumed cash. Ned's behavior grew erratic, his absences longer, his promises unreliable. Evelyn managed what she could, but control was slipping. Not suddenly, gradually, quietly, the way it always does. Chapter 8. Power and Scandal. The lie was simple. Ned McLean told a United States Senate committee that he had personally loaned $100,000 to Albert Fall, the Secretary of the Interior. The loan, he said, explained where Fall had gotten the money to improve his New Mexico ranch. It had nothing to do with oil leases, government contracts, or bribery. That testimony, delivered under oath, held for several weeks before it fell apart. Albert Fall had indeed received $100,000, but not from Ned McLean. The money came from Edward Diney, an oil magnate who had been granted drilling rights on federal land at Elk Hills, California. Additional payments totaling more than $400,000 in cash and bonds came from Harry Sinclair, who received leases at a Wyoming oil reserve called Teapot Dome. Fall had sold access to public resources for private profit. The scandal would eventually send him to prison, making him the first cabinet member in American history convicted of crimes committed while in office. Ned had tried to provide cover for a man who had attended his parties, used his golf course, and enjoyed his hospitality during the years when the McLean name still opened doors. The favor cost him everything except a cell. Senator Thomas Walsh of Montana led the investigation. He shared a surname with Evelyn's father, but there was no blood relation. For months, Walsh methodically dismantled the alibis and cover stories that Fall and his allies had constructed. When Ned's perjury surfaced, Walsh made certain every newspaper in the country reported it. Ned owned the Washington Post. He had spent years using it to cultivate powerful allies and shield them from scrutiny. Now his own publication had to report that its publisher had lied to Congress. The humiliation was complete. Evelyn watched her husband's reputation disintegrate. She knew he was reckless. She had seen him drink through dinners while senators laughed at his jokes and accepted his hospitality. The relationships they had built were transactional, dependent on what the McLeans could provide rather than any genuine bond. What surprised her was the speed of abandonment. The same men who had visited as friends, who had treated the McLean estate as their private retreat, now refused to return calls. Loyalty, it turned out, was another commodity that required constant payment. Ned was never prosecuted. Perjury charges require proof of intent, and his lawyers successfully argued that their client was too foolish to have knowingly deceived anyone. The defense was accurate and devastating. Edward Beale McLean, heir to a newspaper fortune and publisher of 2 major papers, was officially too stupid to be held accountable for his own words. He disappeared into alcohol. The habit that had always troubled him now became his sole occupation. Evelyn managed what remained of their public life, hosting events Ned could no longer attend sober and keeping up appearances that fooled no one who looked closely. She had survived her son's death. She would survive her husband's disgrace. The question was whether anything worth preserving would remain when the surviving was done. Ned McLean believed that wealth was permanent, that influence could always bend circumstances back in his favor. He had grown up watching his father turn power into currency, and currency into power. Newspapers shaped reality. Politics followed money. Consequences were for other people. This belief would prove catastrophic. Ned drank heavily, gambled recklessly, and treated responsibility as an inconvenience rather than a duty. Every warning was dismissed. Every loss was rationalized as temporary. Evelyn watched this unraveling with a mixture of denial and resolve. She had been raised to believe that chaos could be mastered with charm, generosity, and sheer force of will. When Ned embarrassed himself publicly, she compensated privately. When debts mounted, she hosted another dinner. When scandals surfaced, she laughed louder than anyone else in the room. Society mistook this for confidence. In truth, it was survival. The Hope Diamond became central to this performance. Evelyn wore it constantly, not as a talisman of superstition, but as a declaration. The stone announced that she still mattered, that the McLeans still belonged at the center of American power. Its weight on her neck was physical, undeniable. It reminded others of royalty, of empires, of permanence. It reminded her of obligation. Rumors followed her everywhere. Some whispered that the diamond was cursed. Others said Evelyn enjoyed the danger, that she thrived on tempting fate. She dismissed the stories publicly, but privately she understood why people needed them. A curse was easier than admitting that privilege could collapse under its own excess. Myth absolved society of responsibility. If disaster struck, it was the stone, not the system. As the country slid toward economic catastrophe, the contrast grew obscene. Bread lines lengthened while Evelyn's dinners continued. Bank failures rippled outward, quietly at first, then violently. Men who once deferred to the McLeans now avoided their calls. Credit tightened. Old alliances dissolved. The newspaper that had once printed presidents' words began hemorrhaging money. Power, it turned out, was liquid only when confidence remained intact. Evelyn sensed the shift before most of her peers. She had always been a careful observer of rooms, of faces, of pauses in conversation. Invitations came less frequently. Smiles lingered a moment too long. Sympathy crept into voices that once carried envy. Washington was changing, and wealth alone was no longer enough to command obedience. Still, she refused to retreat. If the old rules were failing, she would play the role harder. More charity, bigger gestures, public displays of benevolence meant to remind the nation that the elite still served a purpose. It was not guilt that drove her, but instinct. A belief that generosity could restore balance, that visibility could prevent erasure. By the time the stock market collapsed, the McLeans were already overextended. What followed was not sudden ruin, but erosion, a slow stripping away of certainty. The kind of decline that forces people to confront truths they have avoided for decades. For Ned, it meant denial and deeper indulgence. For Evelyn, it meant endurance. The diamond remained, always visible, always brilliant, a symbol that refused to dim even as everything around it deteriorated. To some, it represented a curse tightening its grip. To others, it was proof that fate was arbitrary and cruel. To Evelyn, it was neither. It was simply what she had left. An object that still commanded attention in a world increasingly indifferent to her suffering. Chapter 9. The Lindbergh Scam. Gaston Means made his living from crisis. He was a detective, a government agent, a fixer for men who needed problems to disappear. The Bureau of Investigation had fired him for corruption. A fraud charge had already put him behind bars once. None of this prevented him from finding new victims. People in pain rarely check references. In March of 1932, the entire nation was in pain. Charles Lindbergh had become the most famous man in the world 5 years earlier when he flew solo across the Atlantic. His infant son, just 20 months old, had been taken from the family home in New Jersey on the 1st of March. Ransom notes demanded $50,000. Weeks passed without resolution. Means saw opportunity. He approached Evelyn Walsh McLean with a tale perfectly calibrated to her weaknesses. He claimed to know people, underworld contacts who moved in circles the police could never penetrate. The kidnappers trusted him, he said. For the right price, he could negotiate the boy's return and spare the Lindbergh family further agony. Evelyn was wealthy, generous to the point of recklessness, and carrying grief of her own. She understood what the Lindberghs must be suffering. She also wanted redemption. Teapot Dome had made the Evalyn name synonymous with scandal. Here was a chance to be remembered for something heroic. She handed over $100,000 in cash, then another $4,000 for expenses. The bills disappeared. Weeks of excuses followed. The kidnappers had moved locations. Means explained. New intermediaries were needed. The situation required patience. Each delay bought time while Evelyn waited for news that would never arrive. On May 12th, a truck driver found remains in woods several miles from the Lindbergh home. The boy had likely died the night he was taken. Every dollar Evelyn had given Means purchased nothing but lies. Means was arrested and charged with larceny. At trial, he insisted his account was true, with the certainty of a man who had deceived so many people he could no longer locate the boundary between invention and fact. The jury deliberated briefly. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The $104,000 was never recovered. Means claimed he had passed it to intermediaries. Investigators believed he had hidden it somewhere, planning to retrieve the cash after his release. He died in Leavenworth in 1938, and if the money still existed, its location went with him. Evelyn had handed a fortune to a known criminal because his version of events matched what she wanted to believe. During the worst years of the Depression, that sum could have sustained 100 families for a year. The newspapers covered the trial eagerly. The McLean name appeared in headlines again and again for reasons that brought shame rather than honor. In interviews afterward, Evelyn refused to call it humiliation. She framed the loss as the price of trying to help. The child had been beyond saving before she ever wrote a check. That did not mean the effort was worthless. She moved on to the next crisis. There would be no shortage of them. For the McLeans, the first losses were dismissed as temporary. Markets corrected. They always had. Ned insisted the downturn was psychological, a failure of nerve that would soon reverse. He continued to spend as if the old rules still applied. Parties at Friendship, weekends in Palm Beach, bills paid late but paid. Evelyn watched quietly. She had grown up wealthy but cautious, raised by a father who believed money was a tool, not a guarantee. What she saw now was different. The system that had rewarded audacity was beginning to punish it. Banks failed. Loans were called. Assets once considered untouchable were suddenly collateral. The Washington Post, long treated as a family possession rather than a business, began to hemorrhage cash. Advertising dried up. Circulation fell. The paper required constant infusions just to survive. Ned responded the only way he knew how, by borrowing more. Each loan bought time, not stability. Each decision narrowed the margin for error. At Friendship, the signs were subtle but unmistakable. Staff was reduced, maintenance deferred. Rooms once alive with guests sat unused, heated but empty. Evelyn continued to host, though the tone had changed. Conversations drifted from optimism to anxiety, from expansion to survival. The guests still wore tuxedos and gowns, but the laughter came later and faded sooner. Everyone understood that something fundamental had shifted. Ned's drinking worsened. Alcohol, once a social lubricant, became a necessity. He missed meetings. He argued with bankers. He lashed out at editors who delivered bad news and ignored those who tried to help. The charm that had once carried him through crises now curdled into volatility. Friends withdrew. Creditors did not. Evelyn absorbed the strain in silence, managing what could still be managed, protecting the children from what could not. Publicly, the McLeans remained symbols of permanence. Privately, they were improvising day by day. Jewelry was sold. Quietly, properties were mortgaged, then remortgaged. The diamond remained. It was not sentiment that kept it. It was visibility. Selling it would have signaled collapse, and collapse in that world was contagious. As the Depression deepened, Washington filled with contrasts too stark to ignore. Bread lines lengthened within sight of embassies. Men slept in parks not far from dinner parties. Evelyn began to notice what her life had insulated her from before. The way poverty settled in, the way it lingered. She read the papers differently now, aware of the distance between the headlines her family printed and the reality outside their windows. By 1931, denial was no longer possible. The losses were permanent. The fortune that had seemed indestructible was gone in all but name. What remained was reputation, debt, and inertia. Ned drifted further from responsibility, retreating into illness and alcohol. Evelyn stepped forward by necessity, not ambition. She negotiated, she paid, she endured. Chapter 10. The Bonus Army. They arrived by freight train, by truck, by foot. Thousands of men who had served in France 15 years earlier promised a bonus and now broke. The certificates Congress had issued in 1924 would not mature until 1945. Waiting 13 more years was not possible. Hunger does not wait. By June of 1932, more than 20,000 had gathered in Washington. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, a bitter echo of the American Expeditionary Force that had shipped them overseas to fight Germany. Empty government buildings became shelters. Shanties rose along the Anacostia River. Families arrived. A small city of desperation took shape within sight of the Capitol Dome. Congress debated their petition. The House passed a bill for early payment. The Senate rejected it. No one left. Evelyn Walsh McLean read about them in the papers her husband nominally owned. The coverage described vagrants, agitators, potential revolutionaries. Hoover saw the encampment as a threat to order. Respectable Washington wanted them gone. Evelyn drove to the camp. What she found were men who looked like the workers her father had employed at Camp Bird decades earlier. Weathered faces, calloused hands, the exhaustion of people who had labored their entire lives and been discarded. These were not revolutionaries. These were Americans who had been told their sacrifice mattered and had learned it did not. She ordered 1,000 sandwiches, coffee, cigarettes. The supplies arrived while men in threadbare uniforms stared at the woman in expensive clothes. Some recognized her name from the society pages. Most simply ate. She returned the next day and the day after that. The papers noted her visits with the same bemused tone they used for all her eccentricities. The woman with the cursed diamond was feeding hobos. Good copy. On July 28th, the order came. General Douglas MacArthur, Army Chief of Staff, led infantry and cavalry down Pennsylvania Avenue. Major George Patton commanded the tanks. The soldiers carried bayonets and gas masks. The marchers assumed the troops would stop. Many had served alongside men just like these. Some had commanded them. The Army would not attack its own. The Army attacked. Tear gas filled the Anacostia camp. Soldiers advanced with fixed bayonets. The shanties burned. Families fled with whatever they could carry. By nightfall, the bonus army had been driven from Washington. 2 men were dead from police gunfire earlier in the day. Hundreds more were injured. MacArthur told reporters he had saved the nation from revolution. The administration defended the action as necessary. The survivors scattered back to the poverty they had briefly escaped. Evelyn watched the smoke rise from across the river. She had fed them sandwiches while the government prepared to burn their shelters. Her generosity had changed nothing concrete. Their service had purchased nothing lasting. The system that had made her wealthy had no place for men whose utility had expired in the trenches. She owned the Hope Diamond. They held paper redeemable in 13 years. The distance between those facts said more about 1932 than any editorial could. Rules were posted and enforced. Alcohol was banned. Violence was discouraged. They elected spokesmen and marshals. Many still carried their discharge papers, folded and worn, proof that they had once been useful to the nation, now pretending not to recognize them. At night, fires burned low as men talked about France. Mud, gas, the sound of artillery rolling over fields that did not belong to them. They had survived that. What they could not survive was being forgotten. Washington watched uneasily. Business leaders feared contagion. Politicians feared precedent. If these men were paid early, others would come. If hunger could rewrite contracts, then the entire system rested on sand. Newspapers emphasized disorder, magnified rumors of communists and radicals. Few mentioned that most of the marchers were married, that many had children sleeping beside them in shacks made of scrap lumber and tar paper. The summer heat pressed down on the camps. Flies gathered, water ran short, disease followed. Still, the men stayed. Leaving meant returning to nothing. Staying meant being seen, at least for a while. From the steps of the Capitol, legislators could look out and see the consequences of their votes. Some did. Most did not. President Hoover never went. Advisors warned that appearing sympathetic would weaken authority. The order had to be preserved. Property had to be protected. The veterans' presence was framed not as a plea, but as an occupation. The language mattered. Occupations could be cleared. Camps could be dismantled. People could be moved. When the eviction order was signed, it carried the weight of inevitability. This was how governments resolved contradictions they could not afford to acknowledge. The soldiers chosen to enforce it were young, many born too late to remember the war the marchers had fought. They wore crisp uniforms. Their boots were polished. Their orders were precise. As the troops advanced, confusion spread through the camps. Some men stood their ground, convinced reason would prevail. Others gathered children and whatever belongings could be carried. Gas canisters arced through the air. Horses pushed into crowds. The sound of coughing replaced the sound of protest. Fires started where no fires were meant to be. Wood burned quickly. So did paper. So did I hope. By morning, the camps were gone. The Anacostia Flats were quiet again. Official statements declared success. Stability had been restored. The capital returned to its routines. Government buildings reopened. The veterans dispersed into rail yards, highways, and forgotten towns across the country, carrying with them the lesson that service was temporary, but abandonment was permanent. Years later, some would say the bonus army changed nothing. Others would say it changed everything. Politicians remembered the images when another war ended and another generation came home. Promises were made differently. Payments were structured sooner. The lesson had been learned, though not without cost. For Evelyn, the memory lingered as a private indictment. She could afford generosity without consequence. The men she had fed could not afford patience. Her wealth insulated her from the violence that resolved the crisis, just as it insulated Congress from the hunger that caused it. The smoke she watched rise from her window marked a boundary she would never cross, the line between sympathy and vulnerability, between observing suffering and being subject to it. The bonus army faded from headlines, then from memory. But for a brief moment in 1932, beneath the dome that symbolized American democracy, thousands of men stood together and asked a simple question: what does a nation owe those who fought for it? The answer came in bayonets and fire. Chapter 11. The Final Years. The Washington Post went at auction on June 1, 1933. Eugene Meyer, a financier with political ambitions, paid $825,000. 4 years earlier, Ned McLean had refused an offer of $5 million. The newspaper his father had built into one of the most influential in the capital fetched less than a sixth of that rejected price. Ned was not present. He was no longer capable of managing his own affairs. 5 months later, a court declared him legally insane. The proceedings were not contested. Everyone who knew Ned understood that alcohol and instability had finally overwhelmed whatever remained of his judgment. He was committed to shepherd an Enoch Pratt Hospital in Baltimore, a psychiatric institution where wealthy families placed relatives they could no longer control or conceal. Evelyn visited when she could bear it. The man in the ward bore little resemblance to the charming, reckless husband she had eloped with 25 years earlier. Ned had become a patient, managed by doctors, confined to grounds he could not leave. The newspapers that had once printed his name in society columns now reported his institutionalization as another chapter in the McLean decline. She continued hosting gatherings at Friendship, though the estate was shrinking. Debts had forced the disposal of portions of the property. The golf course where presidents had played was gone. The grounds that had once sprawled across 75 acres contracted year by year as creditors claimed what they were owed. In 1941, Ned suffered a fatal heart attack in the hospital. He was 56 years old. Evelyn buried him and continued. There was nothing else to do. The war came and went. Friendship itself was purchased by the federal government in 1942 for wartime housing. The estate where Evelyn had entertained Harding and fed the bonus army was demolished. Apartment buildings rose in its place. McLean Gardens, the development was called. The name was all that remained. Evelyn moved to a townhouse in Georgetown, smaller rooms, fewer servants. The Hope Diamond still hung from her neck at dinners, though the dinners were quieter now and the guest lists shorter. Her daughter had married Robert Reynolds, Jr., son of a North Carolina senator. The marriage produced no happiness. In September of 1946, the younger Evelyn was found dead from an overdose of sleeping pills. She was 24 years old. Evelyn Walsh McLean had now buried a brother, a son, a husband, and a daughter. The diamond that supposedly carried a curse had presided over all of it, worn at funerals and hospital visits and quiet evenings where an aging woman sat with her jewelry and her memories. 7 months after losing her daughter, Evelyn developed pneumonia. She died on April 26, 1947. She was 60 years old. The estate she left behind was a tangle of debts and possessions. Her surviving children lacked the means to maintain what remained. In 1949, the family transferred her jewelry collection to Harry Winston, a New York dealer who specialized in famous stones. Winston displayed the Hope Diamond for years, touring it around the country for charity events. He understood its power as spectacle. In November of 1958, he made a decision that Evelyn would have found incomprehensible. He gave the diamond to the Smithsonian Institution. Winston sent it through the United States Mail, first-class registered, insured for $1 million. The postage cost $244. The most famous diamond in the world arrived at the museum in a brown paper package. It remains there today. Visitors line up to see the blue stone that once belonged to kings and adventurers, that supposedly destroyed everyone who owned it, that hung from Evelyn Walsh McLean's neck while her family fell apart around her, one death at a time. The display case offers no verdict on whether any curse was real. It simply presents the diamond, 45.52 carats of crystallized carbon, beautiful and silent about everything it witnessed. The rooms did not swallow grief the way friendship had. Loss echoed more loudly here. The servants were fewer, the evenings shorter, the silences longer. Society still called, but the invitations had changed in tone. Curiosity replaced admiration. Sympathy carried a trace of distance, as though tragedy might be contagious. She continued to wear the Hope Diamond, not out of defiance, but habit. It had become part of her armor. People expected it. Without it, she would have looked like what she was, an aging woman whose wealth had thinned and whose family had nearly vanished. With it, she remained a symbol, an artifact of another Washington, one that believed money could soften every blow. The diamond glittered under dining room chandeliers while conversations drifted toward safer subjects. No one asked how she slept. No one asked whether she believed the stone had taken something from her. Legends were easier than truth. Her surviving children lived at a distance, emotionally if not geographically. They had grown up surrounded by privilege and instability in equal measure, and adulthood brought little relief from either. The McLean name still opened doors, but it no longer protected those who carried it. Debts followed them. Expectations followed them. The past followed them most of all. Evelyn understood this too late. She had believed inheritance meant security. Instead, it had delivered weight. Washington itself was changing. The war reordered the city's priorities, its geography, its memory. The old social hierarchies blurred under rationing and mobilization. New men rose quickly, unburdened by pedigree. Old families faded quietly. Evelyn watched this transformation with the detached familiarity of someone who had already lost her place in the story. She had been central once, photographed, quoted, whispered about. Now she was referenced in the past tense, even while she still lived. When her daughter died in 1946, something final closed within her. Friends noticed it immediately. The grief was not dramatic. There were no scenes, no public collapse. Instead, there was a withdrawal so complete it felt deliberate. She stopped hosting entirely. Jewelry stayed in its cases. Letters went unanswered. The diamond appeared only occasionally, worn not for display, but remembrance. It had been present for every major loss of her adult life. In some way, it had become a witness, and witnesses are hard to part with. Illness came quietly the following spring. Pneumonia was common, almost ordinary, but Evelyn's strength was gone. Years of stress, alcohol, sleepless nights, and grief had thinned her resilience. Doctors came and went. Treatments were attempted. Nothing held. When she died on April 26, 1947, the papers marked her passing with restrained language. She was no longer scandalous enough to sensationalize. She was no longer powerful enough to fear. She had become historical. What remained was confusion. The estate was a puzzle of obligations, unpaid accounts, and objects whose value exceeded the ability to maintain them. Jewelry was the most obvious asset and the most symbolic. In 1949, the family transferred the collection to Harry Winston, who understood immediately what others only sensed. These stones were not merely valuable. They were stories, and the most powerful story of all belonged to the blue diamond that had outlived everyone who feared it. Winston displayed the Hope Diamond relentlessly, moving it from city to city, allowing crowds to press close to the glass. He spoke of it carefully, never endorsing the curse, never denying it. Mystery sold better than certainty. For years, Americans lined up to look at a gem that had once hung from the neck of a woman whose life seemed to confirm every dark rumor attached to it. Then, in 1958, Winston made his final gesture. He wrapped the diamond in brown paper and mailed it to the Smithsonian Institution, first-class registered, insured for $1 million. No ceremony, no procession, just postage. The diamond that had once symbolized monarchy, excess, and private suffering entered the public trust as an object of education and wonder. Today, it rests behind glass, illuminated, measured, labeled. Visitors are told its weight, its cut, its color. They are told where it traveled and who once owned it. What they are not told is how quietly it watched lives unravel, how indifferent it was to grief, how little it offered in return for devotion. The case makes no claims about curses or fate. It simply presents the stone.